Chapter 3, Part 2 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3, Part 2. "Shall I knock?" asked Mrs. Lupin when they reached the chamber door. "No," said Mr. Pecksniff. "Enter, if you please." They went in on tiptoe, or rather the hostess took that precaution, for Mr. Pecksniff always walked softly. The old gentleman was still asleep, and his young companion still sat reading by the fire. "I am afraid," said Mr. Pecksniff, pausing at the door, and giving his head a melancholy roll, "I am afraid that this looks artful. I am afraid, Mrs. Lupin, do you know, that this looks very artful." As he finished this whisper, he advanced before the hostess, and at the same time the young lady, hearing footsteps, rose. Mr. Pecksniff glanced at the volume she held, and whispered Mrs. Lupin again, if possible, with increased despondency. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "it is a good book. I was fearful of that beforehand. I am apprehensive that this is a very deep thing indeed." "What gentleman is this?" inquired the object of his virtuous doubts. "Hush, don't trouble yourself, ma'am," said Mr. Pecksniff, as the landlady was about to answer. "This young—" In spite of himself, he hesitated when person rose to his lips, and substituted another word. "This young stranger, Mrs. Lupin, will excuse me for replying briefly that I reside in this village, it may be in an influential manner, however undeserved, and that I have been summoned here by you. I am here, as I am everywhere, I hope, in sympathy for the sick and sorry." With these impressive words, Mr. Pecksniff passed over to the bedside, where, after patting the counterpane once or twice in a very solemn manner, as if by that means he gained a clear insight into the patient's disorder, he took his seat in a large arm-chair, and, in an attitude of some thoughtfulness and much comfort, waited for his waking. Whatever objection the young lady urged to Mrs. Lupin went no further, for nothing more was said to Mr. Pecksniff, and Mr. Pecksniff said nothing more to anybody else. Full half an hour elapsed before the old man stirred, but at length he turned himself in bed, and, though not yet awake, gave tokens that his sleep was drawing to an end. By little and little he removed the bedclothes from about his head, and turned still more towards the side where Mr. Pecksniff sat. In course of time his eyes opened, and he lay for a few moments, as people newly roused sometimes will, gazing indolently at his visitor without any distinct consciousness of his presence. There was nothing remarkable in these proceedings, except the influence they worked on Mr. Pecksniff, which could hardly have been surpassed by the most marvellous of natural phenomena. Gradually his hands became tightly clasped upon the elbows of the chair, his eyes dilated with surprise, his mouth opened, his hair stood more erect upon his forehead than its custom was, until at length, when the old man rose in bed and stared at him with scarcely less emotion than he showed himself, the Pecksniff doubts were all resolved, and he exclaimed aloud, "You are Martin Chuzzlewit!" His consternation of surprise was so genuine that the old man, with all the disposition that he clearly entertained to believe it assumed, was convinced of its reality. "I am Martin Chuzzlewit," he said bitterly, "and Martin Chuzzlewit wishes you had been hanged before you had come here to disturb him in his sleep. Why, I dreamed of this fellow," he said, lying down again and turning away his face, "before I knew that he was near me." "My good cousin!" said Mr. Pecksniff. "There, his very first words!" cried the old man, shaking his grey head to and fro upon the pillow, and throwing up his hands. "In his very first words he asserts his relationship. I knew he would. They all do it. Near or distant, blood or water, it's all one. Ugh! What a calendar of deceit and lying and false witnessing the sound of any word of kindred opens before me." "Pray do not be hasty, Mr. Chuzzlewit," said Pecksniff, in a tone that was at once in the sublimest degree compassionate and dispassionate, for he had by this time recovered from his surprise, and was in full possession of his virtuous self. "You will regret being hasty, I know you will." "You know!" said Martin contemptuously. "Yes," retorted Mr. Pecksniff, Ay, ay, Mr. Chuzzlewit, and don't imagine that I mean to court or flatter you, for nothing is further from my intention. Neither, sir, need you entertain the least misgiving that I shall repeat that obnoxious word which has given you so much offence already. Why should I? What do I expect or want from you? There is nothing in your possession that I know of, Mr. Chuzzlewit, which is much to be coveted for the happiness it brings you." "That's true enough," muttered the old man. "Apart from that consideration," said Mr. Pecksniff, watchful of the effect he made, "it must be plain to you, I am sure, by this time, that if I had wished to insinuate myself into your good opinion, I should have been of all things careful not to address you as a relative, knowing your humour, and being quite certain beforehand that I could not have a worse letter of recommendation." Martin made not any verbal answer, but he as clearly implied, though only by a motion of his legs beneath the bedclothes, that there was reason in this, and that he could not dispute it, as if he had said as much in good set terms. "No," said Mr. Pecksniff, keeping his hand in his waistcoat as though he were ready, on the shortest notice, to produce his heart for Martin Chuzzlewit's inspection. "I came here to offer my services to a stranger. I make no offer of them to you, because I know you would distrust me if I did. But lying on that bed, sir, I regard you as a stranger, and I have just that amount of interest in you which I hope I should feel in any stranger, circumstanced as you are. Beyond that I am quite as indifferent to you, Mr. Chuzzlewit, as you are to me." Having said which, Mr. Pecksniff threw himself back in the easy chair, so radiant with ingenuous honesty that Mrs. Lupin almost wondered not to see a stained glass glory, such as the saint wore in the church, shining about his head. A long pause succeeded. The old man, with increased restlessness, changed his posture several times. Mrs. Lupin and the young lady gazed in silence at the counterpane. Mr. Pecksniff toyed abstractedly with his eyeglass, and kept his eyes shut, that he might ruminate the better. "Eh?" he said at last, opening them suddenly and looking towards the bed. "I beg your pardon, I thought you spoke, Mrs. Lupin," he continued, slowly rising. "I am not aware that I can be of any service to you here. The gentleman is better, and you are as good a nurse as he can have, eh?" This last note of interrogation bore reference to another change of posture on the old man's part, which brought his face towards Mr. Pecksniff for the first time since he had turned away from him. "If you desire to speak to me before I go, sir," continued that gentleman, after another pause, "you may command my leisure, but I must stipulate, in justice to myself, that you do so as to a stranger, strictly as to a stranger." Now, if Mr. Pecksniff knew from anything Martin Chuzzlewit had expressed in gestures that he wanted to speak to him, he could only have found it out on some such principle as prevails in melodramas, and in virtue of which the elderly farmer with the comic son always knows what the dumb girl means when she takes refuge in his garden, and relates her personal memoirs in incomprehensible pantomime. But without stopping to make any inquiry on this point, Martin Chuzzlewit signed to his young companion to withdraw, which she immediately did, along with the landlady, leaving him and Mr. Pecksniff alone together. For some time they looked at each other in silence, or rather the old man looked at Mr. Pecksniff, and Mr. Pecksniff, again closing his eyes on all outward objects, took an inward survey of his own breast. That it amply repaid him for his trouble, and afforded a delicious and enchanting prospect, was clear from the expression of his face. "You wish me to speak to you as to a total stranger," said the old man, "do you?" Mr. Pecksniff replied, by a shrug of his shoulders and an apparent turning round of his eyes in their sockets before he opened them, that he was still reduced to the necessity of entertaining that desire. "You shall be gratified," said Martin. "Sir, I am a rich man, not so rich as some suppose, perhaps, but yet wealthy. I am not a miser, sir, though even that charge is made against me, as I hear, and currently believed. I have no pleasure in hoarding. I have no pleasure in the possession of money. The devil that we call by that name can give me nothing but unhappiness." It would be no description of Mr. Pecksniff's gentleness of manner to adopt the common parlance, and say that he looked at this moment as if butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. He rather looked as if any quantity of butter might have been made out of him, by churning the milk of human kindness as it spouted upwards from his heart. "For the same reason that I am not a hoarder of money," said the old man, "I am not lavish of it. Some people find their gratification in storing it up, and others theirs in parting with it. But I have no gratification connected with the thing. Pain and bitterness are the only goods it ever could procure for me. I hate it. It is a spectre walking before me through the world and making every social pleasure hideous." A thought arose in Pecksniff's mind which must have instantly mounted to his face, or Martin Chuzzlewit would not have resumed as quickly and as sternly as he did. "You would advise me, for my peace of mind, to get rid of this source of misery, and transfer it to someone who could bear it better. Even you, perhaps, would rid me of a burden under which I suffer so grievously." "But, kind stranger," said the old man, whose every feature darkened as he spoke, "good Christian stranger, that is a main part of my trouble. In other hands I have known money do good. In other hands I have known it triumphed in and boasted of with reason, as the master key to all the brazen gates that close upon the paths to worldly honor, fortune, and enjoyment. To what man or woman, to what worthy, honest, incorruptible creature, shall I confide such a talisman, either now or when I die? Do you know any such person? Your virtues are, of course, inestimable, but can you tell me of any other living creature who will bear the test of contact with myself?" "Of contact with yourself, sir?" echoed Mr. Pecksniff. "Aye," returned the old man, "the test of contact with me, with me. You have heard of him whose misery, the gratification of his own foolish wish, was that he turned everything he touched into gold. The curse of my existence, and the realization of my own mad desire, is that by the golden standard which I bear about me, I am doomed to try the metal of all other men and find it false and hollow." Mr. Pecksniff shook his head and said, "You think so?" "Oh, yes," cried the old man, "I think so. And in your telling me 'I think so,' I recognize the true unworldly ring of your metal. I tell you, man," he added, with increasing bitterness, "that I have gone a rich man among people of all grades and kinds, relatives, friends, and strangers, among people in whom, when I was poor, I had confidence, and justly, for they never once deceived me then, or to me wronged each other. But I have never found one nature, no, not one, in which, being wealthy and alone, I was not forced to detect the latent corruption that lay hid within it, waiting for such as I to bring it forth. Treachery, deceit, and low design, hatred of competitors, real or fancied, for my favor, meanness, falsehood, baseness, and servility, or," and here he looked closely in his cousin's eyes, "or an assumption of honest independence, almost worse than all, these are the beauties which my wealth has brought to light. Brother against brother, child against parent, friends treading on the faces of friends, this is the social company by whom my way has been attended. There are stories told, they may be true or false, of rich men who, in the garb of poverty, have found out virtue and rewarded it. They were dolts and idiots for their pains. They should have made the search in their own characters. They should have shown themselves fit objects, to be robbed and preyed upon and plotted against and adulated by any knaves who, but for joy, would have spat upon their coffins when they died their dupes. And then their search would have ended as mine has done, and they would be what I am." Mr. Pecksniff, not at all knowing what it might be best to say in the momentary pause which ensued upon these remarks, made an elaborate demonstration of intending to deliver something very oracular indeed, trusting to the certainty of the old man interrupting him before he should utter a word. Nor was he mistaken, for Martin Chuzzlewit, having taken breath, went on to say, "Hear me to an end. Judge what profit you are like to gain from any repetition of this visit, and leave me. I have so corrupted and changed the nature of all those who have ever attended on me, by breeding avaricious plots and hopes within them. I have engendered such domestic strife and discord, by tarrying even with members of my own family. I have been such a lighted torch in peaceful homes, kindling up all the inflammable gases and vapors in their moral atmosphere, which, but for me, might have proved harmless to the end, that I have, I may say, fled from all who knew me, and taking refuge in secret places, have lived, of late, the life of one who is hunted. The young girl whom you just now saw— What? Your eye lightens when I talk of her. You hate her already, do you?" "Upon my word, sir," said Mr. Pecksniff, laying his hand upon his breast and dropping his eyelids, "I forgot," cried the old man, looking at him with a keenness which the other seemed to feel, although he did not raise his eyes so as to see it. "I ask your pardon. I forgot you were a stranger. For the moment you reminded me of one Pecksniff, a cousin of mine. As I was saying, the young girl whom you just now saw is an orphan child, whom, with one steady purpose, I have bred and educated, or, if you prefer the word, adopted. For a year or more she has been my constant companion, and she is my only one. I have taken, as she knows, a solemn oath never to leave her sixpence when I die. But while I live I make her an annual allowance, not extravagant in its amount, and yet not stinted. There is a compact between us that no term of affectionate cajolery shall ever be addressed by either to the other, but that she shall call me always by my Christian name, I her by hers. She is bound to me in life by ties of interest, and losing by my death, and having no expectation disappointed, will mourn it perhaps, though for that I care little. This is the only kind of friend I have or will have. Judge from such premises what a profitable hour you have spent in coming here, and leave me to return no more." With these words the old man fell slowly back upon his pillow. Mr. Pecksniff as slowly rose, and with a prefatory hem began as follows: "Mr. Chuzzlewit." "There, go," interposed the other. "Enough of this. I am weary of you." "I am sorry for that, sir," rejoined Mr. Pecksniff, "because I have a duty to discharge, from which, depend upon it, I shall not shrink. No, sir, I shall not shrink." It is a lamentable fact that as Mr. Pecksniff stood erect beside the bed, in all the dignity of goodness, and addressed him thus, the old man cast an angry glance towards the candlestick, as if he were possessed by a strong inclination to launch it at his cousin's head. But he constrained himself, and pointing with his finger to the door, informed him that his road lay there. "Thank you," said Mr. Pecksniff, "I am aware of that. I am going. But before I go, I crave your leave to speak. And more than that, Mr. Chuzzlewit, I must and will, yes indeed I repeat it, must and will be heard. I am not surprised, sir, at anything you have told me to night. It is natural, very natural, and the greater part of it was known to me before. I will not say," continued Mr. Pecksniff, drawing out his pocket handkerchief, and winking with both eyes at once, as it were against his will, "I will not say that you are mistaken in me. While you are in your present mood, I would not say so for the world. I almost wish, indeed, that I had a different nature, that I might repress even this slight confession of weakness, which I cannot disguise from you, which I feel is humiliating, but which you will have the goodness to excuse. We will say, if you please," added Mr. Pecksniff, with great tenderness of manner, "that it arises from a cold in the head, or is attributable to snuff, or smelling salts, or onions, or anything but the real cause." Here he paused for an instant, and concealed his face behind his pocket handkerchief. Then, smiling faintly, and holding the bed furniture with one hand, he resumed: "But, Mr. Chuzzlewit, while I am forgetful of myself, I owe it to myself and to my character, ay, sir, and I have a character which is very dear to me, and will be the best inheritance of my two daughters, to tell you, on behalf of another, that your conduct is wrong, unnatural, indefensible, monstrous. And I tell you, sir," said Mr. Pecksniff, towering on tiptoe among the curtains, as if he were literally rising above all worldly considerations, and were fain to hold on tight, to keep himself from darting skyward like a rocket, "I tell you without fear or favour that it will not do for you to be unmindful of your grandson, young Martin, who has the strongest natural claim upon you. It will not do, sir," repeated Mr. Pecksniff, shaking his head. "You may think it will do, but it won't. You must provide for that young man. You shall provide for him. You will provide for him." "I believe," said Mr. Pecksniff, glancing at the pen and ink, "that in secret you have already done so. Bless you for doing so. Bless you for doing right, sir. Bless you for hating me. And good night." So saying, Mr. Pecksniff waved his right hand with much solemnity, and once more inserting it in his waistcoat, departed. There was emotion in his manner, but his step was firm. Subject to human weaknesses, he was upheld by conscience. Martin lay for some time, with an expression on his face of silent wonder, not unmixed with rage. At length he muttered in a whisper, "What does this mean? Can the false-hearted boy have chosen such a tool as yonder fellow who has just gone out? Why not? He has conspired against me like the rest, and they are but birds of one feather. A new plot, a new plot. Oh, self, self, self! At every turn nothing but self. He fell to trifling, as he ceased to speak, with the ashes of the burnt paper in the candlestick. He did so at first in pure abstraction, but they presently became the subject of his thoughts. Another will made and destroyed, he said. Nothing determined on, nothing done, and I might have died to-night. I plainly see to what foul uses all this money will be put at last, he cried, almost writhing in the bed. After filling me with cares and miseries all my life, it will perpetuate discord and bad passions when I am dead. So it always is. What lawsuits grow out of the graves of rich men every day, sowing perjury, hatred, and lies among near kindred, where there should be nothing but love. Heaven help us, we have much to answer for. Oh, self, self, self! Every man for himself, and no creature for me. Universal self! Was there nothing of its shadow in these reflections, and in the history of Martin Chuzzlewit on his own showing? End of chapter 3. Chapter 4, Part 1 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 4, from which it will appear that if union be strength, and family affection be pleasant to contemplate, the Chuzzlewits were the strongest and most agreeable family in the world. Part 1. That worthy man, Mr. Pecksniff, having taken leave of his cousin in the solemn terms recited in the last chapter, withdrew to his own home, and remained there 3 whole days, not so much as going out for a walk beyond the boundaries of his own garden, lest he should be hastily summoned to the bedside of his penitent and remorseful relative, whom, in his ample benevolence, he had made up his mind to forgive unconditionally, and to love on any terms. But such was the obstinacy, and such the bitter nature of that stern old man, that no repentant summons came, and the 4th day found Mr. Pecksniff apparently much farther from his Christian object than the first. During the whole of this interval, he haunted the dragon at all times and seasons, in the day and night, and, returning good for evil, evinced the deepest solicitude in the progress of the obdurate invalid, insomuch that Mrs. Lupin was fairly melted by his disinterested anxiety, for he often particularly required her to take notice that he would do the same by any stranger or pauper in the like condition, and shed many tears of admiration and delight. Meantime old Martin Chuzzlewit remained shut up in his own chamber, and saw no person but his young companion, saving the hostess of the Blue Dragon, who was at certain times admitted to his presence. So surely as she came into the room, however, Martin feigned to fall asleep. It was only when he and the young lady were alone that he would utter a word, even in answer to the simplest inquiry, though Mr. Pecksniff could make out, by hard listening at the door, that they two being left together, he was talkative enough. It happened on the 4th evening that Mr. Pecksniff, walking as usual into the bar of the Dragon, and finding no Mrs. Lupin there, went straight upstairs, purposing, in the fervour of his affectionate zeal, to apply his ear once more to the keyhole, and quiet his mind by assuring himself that the hard-hearted patient was going on well. It happened that Mr. Pecksniff, coming softly upon the dark passage into which a spiral ray of light usually darted through the same keyhole, was astonished to find no such ray visible. And it happened that Mr. Pecksniff, when he had felt his way to the chamber door, stooping hurriedly down to ascertain by personal inspection whether the jealousy of the old man had caused this keyhole to be stopped on the inside, brought his head into such violent contact with another head that he could not help uttering in an audible voice the monosyllable "Oh!" which was, as it were, sharply unscrewed and jerked out of him by very anguish. It happened then, and lastly, that Mr. Pecksniff found himself immediately collared by something which smelt like several damp umbrellas, a barrel of beer, a cask of warm brandy and water, and a small parlour full of stale tobacco smoke mixed, and was straightway led downstairs into the bar from which he had lately come, where he found himself standing opposite to, and in the grasp of, a perfectly strange gentleman of still stranger appearance, who, with his disengaged hand, rubbed his own head very hard, and looked at him, Pecksniff, with an evil countenance. The gentleman was of that order of appearance which is currently termed shabby genteel, though in respect of his dress he can hardly be said to have been in any extremities, as his fingers were a long way out of his gloves, and the soles of his feet were at an inconvenient distance from the upper leather of his boots. His nether garments were of a bluish grey, violent in its colours once, but sobered now by age and dinginess, and were so stretched and strained in a tough conflict between his braces and his straps, that they appeared every moment in danger of flying asunder at the knees. His coat, in colour blue, and of a military cut, was buttoned and frogged up to his chin. His cravat was, in hue and pattern, like one of those mantles which hairdressers are accustomed to wrap about their clients during the progress of the professional mysteries. His hat had arrived at such a pass that it would have been hard to determine whether it was originally white or black, but he wore a moustache, a shaggy moustache too, nothing in the meek and merciful way, but quite in the fierce and scornful style, the regular satanic sort of thing, and he wore besides a vast quantity of unbrushed hair. He was very dirty and very jaunty, very bold and very mean, very swaggering and very slinking, very much like a man who might have been something better, and unspeakably like a man who deserved to be something worse. "You were eavesdropping at that door, you vagabond," said this gentleman. Mr. Pecksniff cast him off, as St. George might have repudiated the dragon in that animal's last moments, and said, "Where is Mrs. Lupin, I wonder? Can the good woman possibly be aware that there is a person here who—" "Stay," said the gentleman, "wait a bit, she does know. What then?" "What then, sir?" cried Mr. Pecksniff. "What then? Do you know, sir, that I am the friend and relative of that sick gentleman, that I am his protector, his guardian, his—" "Not his niece's husband," interposed the stranger. "I'll be sworn, for he was there before you." "What do you mean?" said Mr. Pecksniff, with indignant surprise. "What do you tell me, sir?" "Wait a bit," cried the other. "Perhaps you are a cousin. The cousin who lives in this place?" "I am the cousin who lives in this place," replied the man of worth. "Your name is Pecksniff?" said the gentleman. "It is." "I am proud to know you, and I ask your pardon," said the gentleman, touching his hat, and subsequently diving behind his cravat for a shirt collar, which, however, he did not succeed in bringing to the surface. "You behold in me, sir, one who has also an interest in that gentleman upstairs. Wait a bit." As he said this, he touched the tip of his high nose by way of intimation that he would let Mr. Pecksniff into a secret presently, and pulling off his hat, began to search inside the crown among a mass of crumpled documents and small pieces of what may be called the bark of broken cigars, whence he presently selected the cover of an old letter, begrimed with dirt and redolent of tobacco. "Read that," he cried, giving it to Mr. Pecksniff. "This is addressed to Chevy Slyme, Esquire," said that gentleman. "You know Chevy Slyme, Esquire, I believe," returned the stranger. Mr. Pecksniff shrugged his shoulders, as though he would say, "I know there is such a person, and I am sorry for it." "Very good," remarked the gentleman. "That is my interest and business here." With that he made another dive for his shirt collar, and brought up a string. "Now this is very distressing, my friend," said Mr. Pecksniff, shaking his head, and smiling composedly. "It is very distressing to me to be compelled to say that you are not the person you claim to be. I know, Mr. Slyme, my friend, this will not do. Honesty is the best policy. You had better not. You had indeed." "Stop," cried the gentleman, stretching forth his right arm, which was so tightly wedged into his threadbare sleeve that it looked like a cloth sausage. "Wait a bit." He paused to establish himself immediately in front of the fire with his back towards it. Then, gathering the skirts of his coat under his left arm, and smoothing his moustache with his right thumb and forefinger, he resumed: "I understand your mistake, and I am not offended. Why? Because it's complimentary. You suppose I would set myself up for Chevy Slyme, sir? If there is a man on earth whom a gentleman would feel proud and honoured to be mistaken for, that man is my friend Slyme. For he is, without an exception, the highest minded, the most independent spirited, most original, spiritual, classical, talented, the most thoroughly Shakespearean, if not Miltonic, and at the same time the most disgustingly unappreciated dog I know. But, sir, I have not the vanity to attempt to pass for Slyme. Any other man in the wide world I am equal to, but Slyme is, I frankly confess, a great many cuts above me. Therefore you are wrong." "I judged from this," said Mr. Pecksniff, holding out the cover of the letter. "No doubt you did," returned the gentleman. "But, Mr. Pecksniff, the whole thing resolves itself into an instance of the peculiarities of genius. Every man of true genius has his peculiarities, sir. The peculiarity of my friend Slyme is, that he is always waiting round the corner. He is perpetually round the corner, sir. He is round the corner at this instant." "Now," said the gentleman, shaking his forefinger before his nose, and planting his legs wider apart as he looked attentively in Mr. Pecksniff's face, "that is a remarkably curious and interesting trait in Mr. Slyme's character. And whenever Slyme's life comes to be written, that trait must be thoroughly worked out by his biographer, or society will not be satisfied. Observe me, society will not be satisfied." Mr. Pecksniff coughed. "Slyme's biographer, sir, whoever he may be," resumed the gentleman, "must apply to me, or if I am gone, to that what's his name from which no thingamabob comes back. He must apply to my executors for leave to search among my papers. I have taken a few notes in my poor way of some of that man's proceedings, my adopted brother, sir, which would amaze you. He made use of an expression, sir, only on the 15th of last month, when he couldn't meet a little bill, and the other party wouldn't renew, which would have done honour to Napoleon Bonaparte in addressing the French army." "And pray," asked Mr. Pecksniff, obviously not quite at his ease, "what may be Mr. Slyme's business here, if I may be permitted to inquire, who am compelled, by a regard for my own character, to disavow all interest in his proceedings?" "In the first place," returned the gentleman, "you will permit me to say that I object to that remark, and that I strongly and indignantly protest against it on behalf of my friend Slyme. In the next place, you will give me leave to introduce myself. My name, sir, is Tigg. The name of Montague Tigg will perhaps be familiar to you, in connection with the most remarkable events of the Peninsular War?" Mr. Pecksniff gently shook his head. "No matter," said the gentleman. "That man was my father, and I bear his name. I am consequently proud, proud as Lucifer. Excuse me one moment. I desire my friend Slyme to be present at the remainder of this conference." With this announcement he hurried away to the outer door of the Blue Dragon, and almost immediately returned with a companion shorter than himself, who was wrapped in an old blue camlet cloak, with a lining of faded scarlet. His sharp features being much pinched and nipped by long waiting in the cold, and his straggling red whiskers and frowsy hair being more than usually dishevelled from the same cause, he certainly looked rather unwholesome and uncomfortable than Shakespearean or Miltonic. "Now," said Mr. Tigg, clapping one hand on the shoulder of his prepossessing friend, and calling Mr. Pecksniff's attention to him with the other, "you two are related, and relations never did agree and never will, which is a wise dispensation and an inevitable thing, or there would be none but family parties, and everybody in the world would bore everybody else to death. If you were on good terms, I should consider you a most confoundedly unnatural pair. But standing towards each other as you do, I look upon you as a couple of devilish deep-thoughted fellows, who may be reasoned with to any extent." Here Mr. Chevy Slyme, whose great abilities seemed, one and all, to point towards the sneaking quarter of the moral compass, nudged his friend stealthily with his elbow, and whispered in his ear. "Chiv," said Mr. Tigg aloud, in the high tone of one who was not to be tampered with, "I shall come to that presently. I act upon my own responsibility, or not at all. To the extent of such a trifling loan as a crown piece to a man of your talents, I look upon Mr. Pecksniff as certain." And seeing at this juncture that the expression of Mr. Pecksniff's face by no means betokened that he shared this certainty, Mr. Tigg laid his finger on his nose again for that gentleman's private and especial behoof, calling upon him thereby to take notice that the requisition of small loans was another instance of the peculiarities of genius as developed in his friend Slime, that he, Tigg, winked at the same because of the strong metaphysical interest which these weaknesses possessed, and that in reference to his own personal advocacy of such small advances he merely consulted the humour of his friend without the least regard to his own advantage or necessities. "Oh, Chiv, Chiv," added Mr. Tigg, surveying his adopted brother with an air of profound contemplation after dismissing this piece of pantomime, "you are, upon my life, a strange instance of the little frailties that beset a mighty mind. If there had never been a telescope in the world, I should have been quite certain from my observation of you, Chiv, that there were spots on the sun. I wish I may die if this isn't the queerest state of existence that we find ourselves forced into, without knowing why or wherefore, Mr. Pecksniff. Well, never mind. Moralize as we will, the world goes on. As Hamlet says, Hercules may lay about him with his club in every possible direction, but he can't prevent the cats from making a most intolerable row on the roofs of the houses, or the dogs from being shot in the hot weather if they run about the streets unmuzzled. Life's a riddle, a most infernally hard riddle to guess, Mr. Pecksniff. My own opinion's like that celebrated conundrum, wise man in jail like a man out of jail. There's no answer to it. Upon my soul and body, it's the queerest sort of thing altogether, but there's no use in talking about it. Ha ha!" With which consolatory deduction from the gloomy premises recited, Mr. Tigg roused himself by a great effort, and proceeded in his former strain. "Now I'll tell you what it is. I'm a most confoundedly soft-hearted kind of fellow in my way, and I cannot stand by and see you two blades cutting each other's throats, when there's nothing to be got by it. Mr. Pecksniff, you're the cousin of the testator upstairs, and we're the nephew. I say we, meaning Chiv. Perhaps in all essential points you are more nearly related to him than we are. Very good. If so, so be it. But you can't get at him, neither can we. I give you my brightest word of honour, sir, that I've been looking through that keyhole with short intervals of rest ever since 9 o'clock this morning, in expectation of receiving an answer to one of the most moderate and gentlemanly applications for a little temporary assistance, only £15 in my security, that the mind of man can conceive. In the meantime, sir, he is perpetually closeted with, and pouring his whole confidence into the bosom of, a stranger. Now I say decisively, with regard to this state of circumstances, that it won't do, that it won't act, that it can't be, and that it must not be suffered to continue." "Every man," said Mr. Pecksniff, "has a right, an undoubted right, which I for one would not call in question for any earthly consideration. Oh no! To regulate his own proceedings by his own likings and dislikings, supposing they are not immoral and not irreligious. I may feel in my own breast that Mr. Chuzzlewit does not regard me, for instance, say me, with exactly that amount of Christian love which should subsist between us. I may feel grieved and hurt at the circumstance. Still I may not rush to the conclusion that Mr. Chuzzlewit is wholly without a justification in all his coldnesses. Heaven forbid! Besides, how, Mr. Tigg," continued Pecksniff, even more gravely and impressively than he had spoken yet, "how could Mr. Chuzzlewit be prevented from having these peculiar and most extraordinary confidences of which you speak, the existence of which I must admit, and which I cannot but deplore, for his sake? Consider, my good sir," and here Mr. Pecksniff eyed him wistfully, "how very much at random you are talking." "Why, as to that," rejoined Tigg, "it certainly is a difficult question." "Undoubtedly it is a difficult question," Mr. Pecksniff answered. As he spoke he drew himself aloft, and seemed to grow more mindful suddenly of the moral gulf between himself and the creature he addressed. "Undoubtedly it is a very difficult question, and I am far from feeling sure that it is a question any one is authorized to discuss. Good evening to you." "You don't know that the Spottletoes are here, I suppose?" said Mr. Tigg. "What do you mean, sir? What Spottletoes?" asked Pecksniff, stopping abruptly on his way to the door. "Mr. and Mrs. Spottletoe," said Chevy Slyme, Esquire, speaking aloud for the first time, and speaking very sulkily, shambling with his legs the while. "Spottletoe married my father's brother's child, didn't he? And Mrs. Spottletoe is Chuzzlewit's own niece, isn't she? She was his favourite once. You may well ask what Spottletoes." "Now, upon my sacred word," cried Mr. Pecksniff, looking upwards, "this is dreadful. The rapacity of these people is absolutely frightful." "It's not only the Spottletoes either, Tig," said Slyme, looking at that gentleman, and speaking at Mr. Pecksniff. "Anthony Chuzzlewit and his son have got wind of it, and have come down this afternoon. I saw 'em not 5 minutes ago, when I was waiting round the corner." "Oh, Mammon, Mammon!" cried Mr. Pecksniff, smiting his forehead. "So there," said Slyme, regardless of the interruption, "are his brother and another nephew for you already." "This is the whole thing, sir," said Mr. Tigg. "This is the point and purpose at which I was gradually arriving, when my friend Slyme here, with 6 words, hit it full. Mr. Pecksniff, now that your cousin and Chiv's uncle has turned up, some steps must be taken to prevent his disappearing again, and, if possible, to counteract the influence which is exercised over him now by this designing favourite. Everybody who is interested feels it, sir. The whole family is pouring down to this place. The time has come when individual jealousies and interests must be forgotten for a time, sir, and union must be made against the common enemy. When the common enemy is routed, you will all set up for yourselves again. Every lady and gentleman who has a part in the game will go on in their own account and bowl away to the best of their ability at the testator's wicket, and nobody will be in a worse position than before. Think of it. Don't commit yourself now. You'll find us at the Half Moon and 7 Stars in this village at any time, and open to any reasonable proposition. Ahem. Chiv, my dear fellow, go out and see what sort of a night it is." Mr. Slyme lost no time in disappearing, and it is to be presumed in going round the corner. Mr. Tigg, planting his legs as wide apart as he could be reasonably expected by the most sanguine man to keep them, shook his head at Mr. Pecksniff and smiled. "We must not be too hard," he said, "upon the little eccentricities of our friend Slyme. You saw him whisper me." Mr. Pecksniff had seen him. "You heard my answer, I think?" Mr. Pecksniff had heard it. 5 shillings, eh?" said Mr. Tigg thoughtfully. "Ah, what an extraordinary fellow! Very moderate, too." Mr. Pecksniff made no answer. 5 shillings," pursued Mr. Tigg, musing, "and to be punctually repaid next week. That's the best of it. You heard that?" Mr. Pecksniff had not heard that. "No? You surprise me," cried Tigg. "That's the cream of the thing, sir. I never knew that man fail to redeem a promise in my life. You're not in want of change, are you?" "No," said Mr. Pecksniff, "thank you, not at all." "Just so," returned Mr. Tigg. "If you had been, I'd have got it for you." With that he began to whistle, but a dozen seconds had not elapsed when he stopped short, and looking earnestly at Mr. Pecksniff, said, "Perhaps you'd rather not lend Slyme 5 shillings." "I would much rather not," Mr. Pecksniff rejoined. "Egad!" cried Tigg, gravely nodding his head, as if some ground of objection occurred to him at that moment for the first time, "it's very possible you may be right. Would you entertain the same sort of objection to lending me 5 shillings now?" "Yes, I couldn't do it indeed," said Mr. Pecksniff. "Not even half a crown, perhaps?" urged Mr. Tigg. "Not even half a crown. Why, then, we come," said Mr. Tigg, "to the ridiculously small amount of 18 pence. Ha, ha!" "And that," said Mr. Pecksniff, "would be equally objectionable." On receipt of this assurance, Mr. Tigg shook him heartily by both hands, protesting with much earnestness that he was one of the most consistent and remarkable men he had ever met, and that he desired the honour of his better acquaintance. He moreover observed that there were many little characteristics about his friend Slyme of which he could by no means, as a man of strict honour, approve, but that he was prepared to forgive him all these slight drawbacks, and much more, in consideration of the great pleasure he himself had that day enjoyed in his social intercourse with Mr. Pecksniff, which had given him a far higher and more enduring delight than the successful negotiation of any small loan on the part of his friend could possibly have imparted. With which remarks he would beg leave, he said, to wish Mr. Pecksniff a very good evening, and so he took himself off, as little abashed by his recent failure as any gentleman would desire to be. End of Chapter 4, Part 1. Chapter 4, Part 2 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 4, Part 2. The meditations of Mr. Pecksniff that evening at the bar of the Dragon, and that night in his own house, were very serious and grave indeed, the more especially as the intelligence he had received from Messrs. Tigg and Slime, touching the arrival of other members of the family, were fully confirmed on more particular inquiry. For the Spottletoes had actually gone straight to the Dragon, where they were at that moment housed and mounting guard, and where their appearance had occasioned such a vast sensation that Mrs. Lupin, scenting their errand before they had been under her roof half an hour, carried the news herself, with all possible secrecy, straight to Mr. Pecksniff's house. Indeed, it was her great caution in doing so which occasioned her to miss that gentleman, who entered at the front door of the Dragon just as she emerged from the back one. Moreover, Mr. Anthony Chuzzlewit and his son Jonas were economically quartered at the Half Moon and Seven Stars, which was an obscure alehouse, and by the very next coach there came posting to the scene of action so many other affectionate members of the family, who quarrelled with each other inside and out all the way down, to the utter distraction of the coachman, that in less than 24 hours the scanty tavern accommodation was at a premium, and all the private lodgings in the place, amounting to full 4 beds and sofa, rose cent per cent in the market. In a word, things came to that pass that nearly the whole family sat down before the Blue Dragon and formally invested it, and Martin Chuzzlewit was in a state of siege. But he resisted bravely, refusing to receive all letters, messages, and parcels, obstinately declining to treat with anybody, and holding out no hope or promise of capitulation. Meantime the family forces were perpetually encountering each other in divers parts of the neighbourhood, and as no one branch of the Chuzzlewit tree had ever been known to agree with another within the memory of man, there was such a skirmishing and flouting and snapping off of heads in the metaphorical sense of that expression, such a bandying of words and calling of names, such an upturning of noses and wrinkling of brows, such a formal interment of good feelings and violent resurrection of ancient grievances, as had never been known in those quiet parts since the earliest record of their civilized existence. At length, in utter despair and hopelessness, some few of the belligerents began to speak to each other, in only moderate terms of mutual aggravation, and nearly all addressed themselves with a show of tolerable decency to Mr. Pecksniff, in recognition of his high character and influential position. Thus, by little and little, they made common cause of Martin Chuzzlewit's obduracy, until it was agreed, if such a word can be used in connection with the Chuzzlewits, that there should be a general council and conference held at Mr. Pecksniff's house upon a certain day at noon, which all members of the family who had brought themselves within reach of the summons were forthwith bidden and invited solemnly to attend. If ever Mr. Pecksniff wore an apostolic look, he wore it on this memorable day. If ever his unruffled smile proclaimed the words, "I am a messenger of peace," that was its mission now. If ever man combined within himself all the mild qualities of the lamb, with a considerable touch of the dove, and not a dash of the crocodile, or the least possible suggestion of the very mildest seasoning of the serpent, that man was he. And oh, the 2 Miss Pecksniffs! Oh, the serene expression on the face of Charity, which seemed to say, "I know that all my family have injured me beyond the possibility of reparation, but I forgive them, for it is my duty to do so." And oh, the gay simplicity of Mercy, so charming, innocent, and infant-like, that if she had gone out walking by herself, and it had been a little earlier in the season, the robin redbreasts might have covered her with leaves against her will, believing her to be one of the sweet children in the wood, come out of it and issuing forth once more to look for blackberries in the young freshness of her heart. What words can paint the Pecksniffs in that trying hour? Oh, none, for words have naughty company among them, and the Pecksniffs were all goodness. But when the company arrived, that was the time when Mr. Pecksniff, rising from his seat at the table's head, with a daughter on either hand, received his guests in the best parlour, and motioned them to chairs, with eyes so overflowing, and countenance so damp with gracious perspiration, that he may be said to have been in a kind of moist meekness, and the company, the jealous, stony-hearted, distrustful company, who were all shut up in themselves, and had no faith in anybody, and wouldn't believe anything, and would no more allow themselves to be softened or lulled asleep by the Pecksniffs than if they had been so many hedgehogs or porcupines. First there was Mr. Spottletoe, who was so bald and had such big whiskers that he seemed to have stopped his hair by the sudden application of some powerful remedy in the very act of falling off his head, and to have fastened it irrevocably on his face. Then there was Mrs. Spottletoe, who, being much too slim for her years, and of a poetical constitution, was accustomed to inform her more intimate friends that the said whiskers were the lodestar of her existence, and who could now, by reason of her strong affection for her uncle Chuzzlewit, and the shock it gave her to be suspected of testamentary designs upon him, do nothing but cry, except moan. Then there were Anthony Chuzzlewit and his son Jonas. The face of the old man, so sharpened by the wariness and cunning of his life, that it seemed to cut him a passage through the crowded room as he edged away behind the remotest chairs; while the son had so well profited by the precept and example of the father, that he looked a year or two the elder of the twain, as they stood winking their red eyes side by side, and whispering to each other softly. Then there was the widow of a deceased brother of Mr. Martin Chuzzlewit, who, being almost supernaturally disagreeable, and having a dreary face and a bony figure and a masculine voice, was, in right of these qualities, what is commonly called a strong-minded woman, and who, if she could, would have established her claim to the title, and have shown herself, mentally speaking, a perfect Samson, by shutting up her brother-in-law in a private madhouse, until he proved his complete sanity by loving her very much. Beside her sat her spinster daughters, 3 in number, and of gentlemanly deportment, who had so mortified themselves with tight stays that their tempers were reduced to something less than their waists, and sharp lacing was expressed in their very noses. Then there was a young gentleman, grand-nephew of Mr. Martin Chuzzlewit, very dark and very hairy, and apparently born for no particular purpose but to save looking-glasses the trouble of reflecting more than just the first idea and sketchy notion of a face, which had never been carried out. Then there was a solitary female cousin, who was remarkable for nothing but being very deaf, and living by herself, and always having the toothache. Then there was George Chuzzlewit, a gay bachelor cousin, who claimed to be young, but had been younger, and was inclined to corpulency, and rather overfed himself, to that extent indeed that his eyes were strained in their sockets, as if with constant surprise, and he had such an obvious disposition to pimples, that the bright spots on his cravat, the rich pattern on his waistcoat, and even his glittering trinkets, seemed to have broken out upon him, and not to have come into existence comfortably. Last of all there were present Mr. Chevy Slyme and his friend Tig, and it is worthy of remark that although each person present disliked the other, mainly because he or she did belong to the family, they one and all concurred in hating Mr. Tig because he didn't. Such was the pleasant little family circle now assembled in Mr. Pecksniff's best parlour, agreeably prepared to fall foul of Mr. Pecksniff or anybody else who might venture to say anything whatever upon any subject. "This," said Mr. Pecksniff, rising and looking round upon them with folded hands, "does me good. It does my daughters good. We thank you for assembling here. We are grateful to you with our whole hearts. It is a blessed distinction that you have conferred upon us, and believe me—" It is impossible to conceive how he smiled here. "We shall not easily forget it." "I am sorry to interrupt you, Pecksniff," remarked Mr. Spottletoe, with his whiskers in a very portentous state, "but you are assuming too much to yourself, sir. Who do you imagine has it in contemplation to confer a distinction upon you, sir?" A general murmur echoed this inquiry, and applauded it. "If you are about to pursue the course with which you have begun, sir," pursued Mr. Spottletoe in a great heat, and giving a violent rap on the table with his knuckles, "the sooner you desist and this assembly separates the better. I am no stranger, sir, to your preposterous desire to be regarded as the head of this family, but I can tell you, sir. Oh yes, indeed. He tell. He. What? He was the head, was he? From the strong-minded woman downwards, everybody fell that instant upon Mr. Spottletoe, who, after vainly attempting to be heard in silence, was fain to sit down again, folding his arms and shaking his head most wrathfully, and giving Mrs. Spottletoe to understand in dumb show that that scoundrel Pecksniff might go on for the present, but he would cut in presently and annihilate him. "I am not sorry," said Mr. Pecksniff, in resumption of his address, "I am really not sorry that this little incident has happened. It is good to feel that we are met here without disguise. It is good to know that we have no reserve before each other, but are appearing freely in our own characters." Here the eldest daughter of the strong-minded woman rose a little way from her seat, and trembling violently from head to foot, more, as it seemed, with passion than timidity, expressed a general hope that some people would appear in their own characters, if it were only for such a proceeding having the attraction of novelty to recommend it, and that when they, meaning the some people before mentioned, talked about their relations, they would be careful to observe who was present in company at the time, otherwise it might come round to those relations' ears in a way they little expected. And as to red noses, she observed, she had yet to learn that a red nose was any disgrace, inasmuch as people neither made nor colored their own noses, but had that feature provided for them without being first consulted, though even upon that branch of the subject she had great doubts whether certain noses were redder than other noses, or indeed half as red as some. This remark being received with a shrill titter by the two sisters of the speaker, Miss Charity Pecksniff begged with much politeness to be informed whether any of those very low observations were levelled at her, and receiving no more explanatory answer than was conveyed in the adage, "Those the cap fits, let them wear it," immediately commenced a somewhat acrimonious and personal retort, wherein she was much comforted and abetted by her sister Mercy, who laughed at the same with great heartiness, indeed far more naturally than life; and it being quite impossible that any difference of opinion can take place among women without every woman who is within hearing taking active part in it, the strong-minded lady and her two daughters, and Mrs. Spottletoe and the deaf cousin, who was not at all disqualified from joining in the dispute by reason of being perfectly unacquainted with its merits, one and all plunged into the quarrel directly. The two Miss Pecksniffs being a pretty good match for the three Miss Chuzzlewits, and all five young ladies having, in the figurative language of the day, a great amount of steam to dispose of, the altercation would no doubt have been a long one, but for the high valour and prowess of the strong-minded woman, who, in right of her reputation for powers of sarcasm, did so belabour and pummel Mrs. Spottletoe with taunting words, that the poor lady, before the engagement was 2 minutes old, had no refuge but in tears. These she shed so plentifully, and so much to the agitation and grief of Mr. Spottletoe, that that gentleman, after holding his clenched fist close to Mr. Pecksniff's eyes, as if it were some natural curiosity, from the near inspection whereof he was likely to derive high gratification and improvement, and after offering, for no particular reason that anybody could discover, to kick Mr. George Chuzzlewit for, and in consideration of, the trifling sum of 6pence, took his wife under his arm and indignantly withdrew. This diversion, by distracting the attention of the combatants, put an end to the strife, which, after breaking out afresh some twice or thrice, in certain inconsiderable spurts and dashes, died away in silence. It was then that Mr. Pecksniff once more rose from his chair. It was then that the two Miss Pecksniffs composed themselves to look as if there were no such beings, not to say present, but in the whole compass of the world, as the three Miss Chuzzlewits, while the three Miss Chuzzlewits became equally unconscious of the existence of the two Miss Pecksniffs. "It is to be lamented," said Mr. Pecksniff, with a forgiving recollection of Mr. Spottletoe's fist, "that our friend should have withdrawn himself so very hastily, though we have cause for mutual congratulation even in that, since we are assured that he is not distrustful of us in regard to anything we may say or do while he is absent. Now that is very soothing, is it not?" "Pecksniff," said Anthony, who had been watching the whole party with peculiar keenness from the first, "don't you be a hypocrite." "A what, my good sir?" demanded Mr. Pecksniff. "A hypocrite." "Charity, my dear," said Mr. Pecksniff, "when I take my chamber candlestick to night, remind me to be more than usually particular in praying for Mr. Anthony Chuzzlewit, who has done me an injustice." This was said in a very bland voice, and aside, as being addressed to his daughter's private ear. With a cheerfulness of conscience, prompting almost a sprightly demeanour, he then resumed: "All our thoughts centring in our very dear but unkind relative, and he being, as it were, beyond our reach, we are met to day, really as if we were a funeral party, except a blessed exception that there is no body in the house." The strong-minded lady was not at all sure that this was a blessed exception. Quite the contrary. "Well, my dear madam," said Mr. Pecksniff, "be that as it may, here we are, and being here, we are to consider whether it is possible by any justifiable means—" "Why, you know as well as I," said the strong-minded lady, "that any means are justifiable in such a case, don't you?" "Very good, my dear madam, very good. Whether it is possible by any means, we will say by any means, to open the eyes of our valued relative to his present infatuation; whether it is possible to make him acquainted by any means with the real character and purpose of that young female, whose very strange position in reference to himself," here Mr. Pecksniff sunk his voice to an impressive whisper, "really casts a shadow of disgrace and shame upon this family, and who, we know," here he raised his voice again, "else why is she his companion? Harbours the very basest designs upon his weakness and his property." In their strong feeling on this point, they, who agreed in nothing else, all concurred as one mind. Good heaven, that she should harbour designs upon his property! The strong-minded lady was for poison, her 3 daughters were for Bridewell and bread and water. The cousin with the toothache advocated Botany Bay, the 2 Miss Pecksniffs suggested flogging. Nobody but Mr. Tigg, who, notwithstanding his extreme shabbiness, was still understood to be in some sort a ladies' man, in right of his upper lip and his frogs, indicated a doubt of the justifiable nature of these measures, and he only ogled the 3 Miss Chuzzlewits with the least admixture of banter in his admiration, as though he would observe, "You are positively down upon her to too great an extent, my sweet creatures, upon my soul you are." "Now," said Mr. Pecksniff, crossing his 2 forefingers in a manner which was at once conciliatory and argumentative, "I will not, upon the one hand, go so far as to say that she deserves all the inflictions which have been so very forcibly and hilariously suggested," one of his ornamental sentences; "nor will I, upon the other, on any account compromise my common understanding as a man by making the assertion that she does not. What I would observe is, that I think some practical means might be devised of inducing our respected, shall I say our revered—" "No," interposed the strong-minded woman in a loud voice. "Then I will not," said Mr. Pecksniff. "You are quite right, my dear madam, and I appreciate and thank you for your discriminating objection. Our respected relative to dispose himself to listen to the promptings of nature, and not to the—" "Go on, Pa," cried Mercy. "Why, the truth is, my dear," said Mr. Pecksniff, smiling upon his assembled kindred, "that I am at a loss for a word. The name of those fabulous animals, pagan, I regret to say, who used to sing in the water, has quite escaped me." Mr. George Chuzzlewit suggested swans. "No," said Mr. Pecksniff, "not swans. Very like swans, too, thank you." The nephew, with the outline of a countenance, speaking for the first and last time on that occasion, propounded oysters. "No," said Mr. Pecksniff, with his own peculiar urbanity, "nor oysters. But by no means unlike oysters. A very excellent idea, thank you, my dear sir, very much. Wait, sirens. Dear me, sirens, of course. I say that means might be devised of disposing our respected relative to listen to the promptings of nature, and not to the siren-like delusions of art. Now we must not lose sight of the fact that our esteemed friend has a grandson, to whom he was, until lately, very much attached, and whom I could have wished to see here to day, for I have a real and deep regard for him. A fine young man, a very fine young man. I would submit to you whether we might not remove Mr. Chuzzlewit's distrust of us, and vindicate our own disinterestedness by—" "If Mr. George Chuzzlewit has anything to say to me," interposed the strong-minded woman sternly, "I beg him to speak out like a man, and not to look at me and my daughters as if he could eat us." "As to looking, I have heard it said, Mrs. Ned," returned Mr. George angrily, "that a cat is free to contemplate a monarch, and therefore I hope I have some right, having been born a member of this family, to look at a person who only came into it by marriage. As to eating, I beg to say, whatever bitterness your jealousies and disappointed expectations may suggest to you, that I am not a cannibal, ma'am." "I don't know that," cried the strong-minded woman. "At all events, if I was a cannibal," said Mr. George Chuzzlewit, greatly stimulated by this retort, "I think it would occur to me that a lady who had outlived 3 husbands, and suffered so very little from their loss, must be uncommonly tough." The strong-minded woman immediately rose. "And I will further add," said Mr. George, nodding his head violently at every second syllable, "naming no names, and therefore hurting nobody but those whose consciences tell them they are alluded to, that I think it would be much more decent and becoming if those who hooked and crooked themselves into this family by getting on the blind side of some of its members before marriage, and manslaughtering them afterwards by crowing over them to that strong pitch that they were glad to die, would refrain from acting the part of vultures in regard to other members of this family who are living. I think it would be full as well, if not better, if those individuals would keep at home, contenting themselves with what they have got, luckily for them, already, instead of hovering about and thrusting their fingers into a family pie, which they flavor much more than enough, I can tell them, when they are 50 miles away." "I might have been prepared for this," cried the strong-minded woman, looking about her with a disdainful smile, as she moved towards the door, followed by her 3 daughters. "Indeed, I was fully prepared for it, from the first. What else could I expect in such an atmosphere as this?" "Don't direct your half-pay officer's gaze at me, ma'am, if you please," interposed Miss Charity, "for I won't bear it." This was a smart stab at a pension enjoyed by the strong-minded woman during her second widowhood and before her last coverture. It told immensely. "I passed from the memory of a grateful country, you very miserable minx," said Mrs. Ned, "when I entered this family. And I feel now, though I did not feel then, that it served me right, and that I lost my claim upon the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland when I so degraded myself. Now, my dears, if you're quite ready, and have sufficiently improved yourselves by taking to heart the genteel example of these 2 young ladies, I think we'll go. Mr. Pecksniff, we are very much obliged to you, really. We came to be entertained, and you have far surpassed our utmost expectations in the amusement you have provided for us. Thank you. Good-bye." With such departing words did this strong-minded female paralyze the Pecksniffian energies, and so she swept out of the room and out of the house, attended by her daughters, who, as with one accord, elevated their 3 noses in the air, and joined in a contemptuous titter. As they passed the parlour window on the outside, they were seen to counterfeit a perfect transport of delight among themselves, and with this final blow and great discouragement for those within, they vanished. Before Mr. Pecksniff or any of his remaining visitors could offer a remark, another figure passed this window, coming at a great rate in the opposite direction, and immediately afterwards Mr. Spottletoe burst into the chamber. Compared with his present state of heat, he had gone out a man of snow or ice. His head distilled such oil upon his whiskers that they were rich and clogged with unctuous drops. His face was violently inflamed, his limbs trembled, and he gasped and strove for breath. "My good sir!" cried Mr. Pecksniff. "Oh, yes," returned the other. "Oh, yes, certainly. Oh, to be sure. Oh, of course. You hear him? You hear him, all of you?" "What's the matter?" cried several voices. "Oh, nothing," cried Spottletoe, still gasping. "Nothing at all. It's of no consequence. Ask him. He'll tell you." "I do not understand our friend," said Mr. Pecksniff, looking about him in utter amazement. "I assure you that he is quite unintelligible to me." "Unintelligible, sir?" cried the other. "Unintelligible! Do you mean to say, sir, that you don't know what has happened? that you haven't decoyed us here, and laid a plot and a plan against us? Will you venture to say that you didn't know Mr. Chuzzlewit was going, sir, and that you don't know he's gone, sir?" "Gone!" was the general cry. "Gone!" echoed Mr. Spottletoe. "Gone while we were sitting here. Gone. Nobody knows where he's gone. Oh, of course not. Nobody knew he was going. Oh, of course not. The landlady thought up to the very last moment that they were merely going for a ride. She had no other suspicion. Oh, of course not. She's not this fellow's creature. Oh, of course not." Adding to these exclamations a kind of ironical howl, and gazing upon the company for one brief instant afterwards, in a sudden silence, the irritated gentleman started off again at the same tremendous pace, and was seen no more. It was in vain for Mr. Pecksniff to assure them that this new and opportune evasion of the family was at least as great a shock and surprise to him as to anybody else. Of all the bullyings and denunciations that were ever heaped on one unlucky head, none can ever have exceeded in energy and heartiness those with which he was complimented by each of his remaining relatives, singly, upon bidding him farewell. The moral position taken by Mr. Tigg was something quite tremendous, and the deaf cousin, who had the complicated aggravation of seeing all the proceedings and hearing nothing but the catastrophe, actually scraped her shoes upon the scraper, and afterwards distributed impressions of them all over the top step, in token that she shook the dust from her feet before quitting that dissembling and perfidious mansion. Mr. Pecksniff had, in short, but one comfort, and that was the knowledge that all these, his relations and friends, had hated him to the very utmost extent before, and that he, for his part, had not distributed among them any more love than, with his ample capital in that respect, he could comfortably afford to part with. This view of his affairs yielded him great consolation, and the fact deserves to be noted, as showing with what ease a good man may be consoled under circumstances of failure and disappointment. End of Chapter 4, Part 2. Chapter 5, Part 1 of Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. Chapter 5, containing a full account of the installation of Mr. Pecksniff's new pupil into the bosom of Mr. Pecksniff's family, with all the festivities held on that occasion, and the great enjoyment of Mr. Pinch. Part 1. The best of architects and land surveyors kept a horse, in whom the enemies already mentioned more than once in these pages pretended to detect a fanciful resemblance to his master. Not in his outward person, for he was a raw-boned, haggard horse, always on a much shorter allowance of corn than Mr. Pecksniff, but in his moral character, wherein, said they, he was full of promise, but of no performance. He was always, in a manner, going to go, and never going. When at his slowest rate of travelling, he would sometimes lift up his legs so high, and display such mighty action, that it was difficult to believe he was doing less than 14 miles an hour, and he was for ever so perfectly satisfied with his own speed, and so little disconcerted by opportunities of comparing himself with the fastest trotters, that the illusion was the more difficult of resistance. He was a kind of animal who infused into the breasts of strangers a lively sense of hope, and possessed all those who knew him better with a grim despair. In what respect, having these points of character, he might be fairly likened to his master, that good man's slanderers only can explain. But it is a melancholy truth, and a deplorable instance of the uncharitableness of the world, that they made the comparison. In this horse, and the hooded vehicle, whatever its proper name might be, to which he was usually harnessed, it was more like a gig with a tumour than anything else. All Mr. Pinch's thoughts and wishes centred one bright frosty morning, for with this gallant equipage he was about to drive to Salisbury alone, there to meet with the new pupil, and thence to bring him home in triumph. Blessings on thy simple heart, Tom Pinch! How proudly dost thou button up that scanty coat, called by a sad misnomer, for these many years a great one, and how thoroughly, as with thy cheerful voice, thou pleasantly adjurest Sam the hostler not to let him go yet. Dost thou believe that quadruped desires to go, and would go if he might? Who could repress a smile of love for thee, Tom Pinch, and not in jest at thy expense, for thou art poor enough already, heaven knows. To think that such a holiday as lies before thee should awaken that quick flow and hurry of the spirits, in which thou settest down again, almost untasted, on the kitchen window-sill, that great white mug, put by thy own hands last night, that breakfast might not hold thee late, and layest yonder crust upon the seat beside thee, to be eaten on the road when thou art calmer in thy high rejoicing. Who, as thou drivest off, a happy man, and noddest with a grateful lovingness to Pecksniff in his nightcap at his chamber window, would not cry, "Heaven speed thee, Tom, and send that thou wert going off for ever to some quiet home, where thou mightst live at peace, and sorrow should not touch thee." What better time for driving, riding, walking, moving through the air by any means, than a fresh frosty morning, when hope runs cheerily through the veins with the brisk blood, and tingles in the frame from head to foot? This was the glad commencement of a bracing day in early winter, such as may put the languid summer season, speaking of it when it can't be had, to the blush, and shame the spring for being sometimes cold by halves. The sheep bells rang as clearly in the vigorous air as if they felt its wholesome influence like living creatures. The trees, in lieu of leaves or blossoms, shed upon the ground a frosty rime that sparkled as it fell, and might have been the dust of diamonds. So it was to Tom. From cottage chimneys smoke went streaming up high, high, as if the earth had lost its grossness, being so fair, and must not be oppressed by heavy vapour. The crust of ice on the else rippling brook was so transparent and so thin in texture that the lively water might of its own free will have stopped, in Tom's glad mind it had, to look upon the lovely morning, and lest the sun should break this charm too eagerly, there moved between him and the ground a mist like that which waits upon the moon on summer nights, the very same to Tom, and wooed him to dissolve it gently. Tom Pinch went on, not fast, but with a sense of rapid motion which did just as well, and as he went all kinds of things occurred to keep him happy. Thus, when he came within sight of the turnpike, and was, a long way off, he saw the tollman's wife, who had that moment checked a wagon, run back into the little house again like mad to say, she knew, that Mr. Pinch was coming up, and she was right, for when he drew within hail of the gate, forth rushed the tollman's children, shrieking in tiny chorus, "Mr. Pinch!" to Tom's intense delight. The very tollman, though an ugly chap in general, and one whom folks were rather shy of handling, came out himself to take the toll and give him rough good morning, and that with all this, and a glimpse of the family breakfast on a little round table before the fire, the crust Tom Pinch had brought away with him acquired as rich a flavour as though it had been cut from a fairy loaf. But there was more than this. It was not only the married people and the children who gave Tom Pinch a welcome as he passed. No, no. Sparkling eyes and snowy breasts came hurriedly to many an upper casement as he clattered by, and gave him back his greeting, not stinted either, but sevenfold good measure. They were all merry, they all laughed, and some of the wickedest among them even kissed their hands as Tom looked back. For who minded poor Mr. Pinch? There was no harm in him. And now the morning grew so fair, and all things were so wide awake and gay, that the sun, seeming to say, Tom had no doubt he said, "I can't stand it any longer, I must have a look," streamed out in radiant majesty. The mist, too shy and gentle for such lusty company, fled off, quite scared before it, and as it swept away, the hills and mounds and distant pasture lands, teeming with placid sheep and noisy crows, came out as bright as though they were unrolled brand new for the occasion. In compliment to which discovery, the brook stood still no longer, but ran briskly off to bear the tidings to the water mill 3 miles away. Mr. Pinch was jogging along, full of pleasant thoughts and cheerful influences, when he saw, upon the path before him, going in the same direction with himself, a traveller on foot, who walked with a light, quick step, and sang as he went, for certain in a very loud voice, but not unmusically. He was a young fellow, of some 5 or 26, perhaps, and was dressed in such a free and fly-away fashion that the long ends of his loose red neckcloth were streaming out behind him quite as often as before, and the bunch of bright winter berries in the buttonhole of his velveteen coat was as visible to Mr. Pinch's rearward observation as if he had worn that garment wrong side foremost. He continued to sing with so much energy that he did not hear the sound of wheels until it was close behind him, when he turned a whimsical face and a very merry pair of blue eyes on Mr. Pinch, and checked himself directly. "Why, Mark," said Tom Pinch, stopping, "who'd have thought of seeing you here? Well, this is surprising." Mark touched his hat, and said, with a very sudden decrease of vivacity, that he was going to Salisbury. "And how spruce you are, too," said Mr. Pinch, surveying him with great pleasure. "Really, I didn't think you were half such a tight-made fellow, Mark." "Thank'ee, Mr. Pinch. Pretty well for that, I believe. It's not my fault, you know. With regard to being spruce, sir, that's where it is, you see." And here he looked particularly gloomy. "Where what is?" Mr. Pinch demanded. "Where the aggravation of it is. Any man may be in good spirits and good temper when he's well dressed. There ain't much credit in that. If I was very ragged and very jolly, then I should begin to feel I had gained a point, Mr. Pinch." "So you were singing just now to bear up, as it were, against being well dressed, eh, Mark?" said Pinch. "Your conversation's always equal to print, sir," rejoined Mark, with a broad grin. "That was it." "Well," cried Pinch, "you are the strangest young man, Mark, I ever knew in my life. I always thought so, but now I am quite certain of it. I am going to Salisbury too. Will you get in? I shall be very glad of your company." The young fellow made his acknowledgments and accepted the offer, stepping into the carriage directly, and seating himself on the very edge of the seat, with his body half out of it, to express his being there on sufferance, and by the politeness of Mr. Pinch. As they went along, the conversation proceeded after this manner. "I more than half believed just now, seeing you so very smart," said Pinch, "that you must be going to be married, Mark." "Well, sir, I've thought of that too," he replied. "There might be some credit in being jolly with a wife, especially if the children had the measles and that, and was very fractious indeed. But I'm almost afraid to try it. I don't see my way clear." "You're not very fond of anybody, perhaps," said Pinch. "Not particular, sir, I think." "But the way would be, you know, Mark, according to your views of things," said Mr. Pinch, "to marry somebody you didn't like, and who was very disagreeable." "So it would, sir, but that might be carrying out a principle a little too far, mightn't it?" "Perhaps it might," said Mr. Pinch, at which they both laughed gaily. "Lord bless you, sir," said Mark, "you don't half know me, though. I don't believe there ever was a man as could come out so strong under circumstances that would make other men miserable, as I could if I could only get a chance. But I can't get a chance. It's my opinion that nobody never will know half of what's in me unless something very unexpected turns up, and I don't see any prospect of that. I'm a-going to leave the Dragon, sir." "Going to leave the Dragon!" cried Mr. Pinch, looking at him with great astonishment. "Why, Mark, you take my breath away." "Yes, sir," he rejoined, looking straight before him and a long way off, as men do sometimes when they cogitate profoundly. "What's the use of my stopping at the Dragon? It ain't at all the sort of place for me. When I left London, I'm a Kentish man by birth, though, and took that situation here, I quite made up my mind that it was the dullest little out-of-the-way corner in England, and that there would be some credit in being jolly under such circumstances. But, Lord, there's no dullness at the Dragon. Skittles, cricket, quoits, ninepins, comic songs, choruses, company round the chimney corner every winter's evening. Any man could be jolly at the Dragon. There's no credit in that." "But if common report be true for once, Mark, as I think it is, being able to confirm it by what I know myself," said Mr. Pinch, "you are the cause of half this merriment, and set it going." "There may be something in that too, sir," answered Mark, "but that's no consolation." "Well," said Mr. Pinch, after a short silence, his usually subdued tone being even now more subdued than ever, "I can hardly think enough of what you tell me. Why, what will become of Mrs. Lupin, Mark?" Mark looked more fixedly before him, and further off still, as he answered that he didn't suppose it would be much of an object to her. There were plenty of smart young fellows as would be glad of the place. He knew a dozen himself. "That's probable enough," said Mr. Pinch, "but I am not at all sure that Mrs. Lupin would be glad of them. Why, I always supposed that Mrs. Lupin and you would make a match of it, Mark, and so did everyone, as far as I know." "I never," Mark replied in some confusion, "said nothing as was in a direct way courting like to her, nor she to me. But I don't know what I mightn't do one of these odd times in which she mightn't say in answer. Well, sir, that wouldn't suit." "Not to be landlord of the Dragon, Mark?" cried Mr. Pinch. "No, sir, certainly not," returned the other, withdrawing his gaze from the horizon and looking at his fellow traveller. "Why, that would be the ruin of a man like me. I go and sit down comfortably for life, and no man never finds me out. What would be the credit of the landlord of the Dragon's being jolly? Why, he couldn't help it if he tried." "Does Mrs. Lupin know you are going to leave her?" Mr. Pinch inquired. "I haven't broke it to her yet, sir, but I must. I'm looking out this morning for something new and suitable," he said, nodding towards the city. "What kind of thing, now?" Mr. Pinch demanded. "I was thinking," Mark replied, "of something in the grave digging way." "Good gracious, Mark!" cried Mr. Pinch. "It's a good damp wormy sort of business, sir," said Mark, shaking his head argumentatively, "and there might be some credit in being jolly with one's mind in that pursuit, unless grave diggers is usually given that way, which would be a drawback. You don't happen to know how that is in general, do you, sir?" "No," said Mr. Pinch, "I don't indeed. I never thought upon the subject." "In case of that not turning out as well as one could wish, you know," said Mark, musing again, "there's other businesses. Undertaking, now, that's gloomy. There might be credit to be gained there. A broker's man in a poor neighbourhood wouldn't be bad, perhaps. A jailer sees a deal of misery. A doctor's man is in the very midst of murder. A bailiff's a'n't a lively office, naturally. Even a tax gatherer must find his feelings rather worked upon at times. There's lots of trades in which I should have an opportunity, I think." Mr. Pinch was so perfectly overwhelmed by these remarks that he could do nothing but occasionally exchange a word or two on some indifferent subject, and cast sidelong glances at the bright face of his odd friend, who seemed quite unconscious of his observation, until they reached a certain corner of the road, close upon the outskirts of the city, when Mark said he would jump down there if he pleased. "But bless my soul, Mark," said Mr. Pinch, who in the progress of his observation just then made the discovery that the bosom of his companion's shirt was as much exposed as if it was midsummer, and was ruffled by every breath of air, "why don't you wear a waistcoat?" "What's the good of one, sir?" asked Mark. "Good of one?" said Mr. Pinch. "Why, to keep your chest warm." "Lord love you, sir," cried Mark, "you don't know me. My chest don't want no warming. Even if it did, what would no waistcoat bring it to? Inflammation of the lungs, perhaps? Well, there'd be some credit in being jolly with the inflammation of the lungs." As Mr. Pinch returned no other answer than such as was conveyed in his breathing very hard, and opening his eyes very wide, and nodding his head very much, Mark thanked him for his ride, and without troubling him to stop, jumped lightly down. And away he fluttered with his red neckerchief and his open coat, down a cross lane, turning back from time to time to nod to Mr. Pinch, and looking one of the most careless, good-humoured, comical fellows in life. His late companion, with a thoughtful face, pursued his way to Salisbury. Mr. Pinch had a shrewd notion that Salisbury was a very desperate sort of place, an exceeding wild and dissipated city, and when he had put up the horse and given the hostler to understand that he would look in again in the course of an hour or two to see him take his corn, he set forth on a stroll about the streets with a vague and not unpleasant idea that they teemed with all kinds of mystery and bedevilment. To one of his quiet habits this little delusion was greatly assisted by the circumstance of its being market day, and the thoroughfares about the market place being filled with carts, horses, donkeys, baskets, wagons, garden stuff, meat, tripe, pies, poultry, and hucksters' wares of every opposite description and possible variety of character. Then there were young farmers and old farmers, with smock frocks, brown greatcoats, drab greatcoats, red worsted comforters, leather leggings, wonderful shaped hats, hunting whips, and rough sticks, standing about in groups, or talking noisily together on the tavern steps, or paying and receiving huge amounts of greasy wealth with the assistance of such bulky pocket books that when they were in their pockets it was apoplexy to get them out, and when they were out it was spasms to get them in again. Also there were farmers' wives in beaver bonnets and red cloaks, riding shaggy horses purged of all earthly passions, who went soberly into all manner of places without desiring to know why, and who, if required, would have stood stock still in a china shop, with a complete dinner service at each hoof. Also a great many dogs who were strongly interested in the state of the market and the bargains of their masters, and a great confusion of tongues, both brute and human. Mr. Pinch regarded everything exposed for sale with great delight, and was particularly struck by the itinerant cutlery, which he considered of the very keenest kind, insomuch that he purchased a pocket knife with 7 blades in it, and not a cut, as he afterwards found out, among them. When he had exhausted the market-place, and watched the farmers safe into the market dinner, he went back to look after the horse. Having seen him eat unto his heart's content, he issued forth again, to wander round the town and regale himself with the shop windows, previously taking a long stare at the bank, and wondering in what direction underground the caverns might be where they kept the money, and turning to look back at 1 or 2 young men who passed him, whom he knew to be articled to solicitors in the town, and who had a sort of fearful interest in his eyes, as jolly dogs who knew a thing or two and kept it up tremendously. But the shops. First of all there were the jewellers' shops, with all the treasures of the earth displayed therein, and such large silver watches hanging up in every pane of glass, that if they were anything but first-rate goers, it certainly was not because the works could decently complain of want of room. In good sooth, they were big enough, and perhaps, as the saying is, ugly enough, to be the most correct of all mechanical performers. In Mr. Pinch's eyes, however, they were smaller than Geneva ware, and when he saw one very bloated watch, announced as a repeater, gifted with the uncommon power of striking every quarter of an hour inside the pocket of its happy owner, he almost wished that he were rich enough to buy it. But what were even gold and silver, precious stones and clockwork, to the book shops, whence a pleasant smell of paper freshly pressed came issuing forth, awakening instant recollections of some new grammar had at school, long time ago, with Master Pinch, Grove House Academy, inscribed in faultless writing on the fly-leaf. That whiff of Russia leather, too, and all those rows on rows of volumes neatly ranged within, what happiness did they suggest! And in the window were the spick-and-span new works from London, with the title pages, and sometimes even the first page of the first chapter laid wide open, tempting unwary men to begin to read the book, and then, in the impossibility of turning over, to rush blindly in and buy it. Here, too, were the dainty frontispiece and trim vignette, pointing like handposts on the outskirts of great cities to the rich stock of incident beyond, and store of books, with many a grave portrait and time-honoured name, whose matter he knew well and would have given minds to have, in any form, upon the narrow shelf beside his bed at Mr. Pecksniff's. What a heart-breaking shop it was! There was another, not quite so bad at first, but still a trying shop, where children's books were sold, and where poor Robinson Crusoe stood alone in his might, with dog and hatchet, goat-skin cap and fowling pieces, calmly surveying Philip Quarn and the host of imitators round him, and calling Mr. Pinch to witness that he, of all the crowd, impressed one solitary footprint on the shore of boyish memory, whereof the tread of generations should not stir the lightest grain of sand. And there, too, were the Persian tales, with flying chests, and students of enchanted books shut up for years in caverns. And there, too, was Abadah, the merchant, with the terrible little old woman hobbling out of the box in his bedroom. And there the mighty talisman, the rare Arabian Nights, with Cassim Baba, divided by 4, like the ghost of a dreadful sum, hanging up all gory in the robber's cave. Which matchless wonders, coming fast on Mr. Pinch's mind, did so rub up and chafe that wonderful lamp within him, that when he turned his face towards the busy street, a crowd of phantoms waited on his pleasure, and he lived again, with new delight, the happy days before the Pecksniff era. He had less interest now in the chemists' shops, with their great glowing bottles, with smaller repositories of brightness in their very stoppers, and in their agreeable compromises between medicine and perfumery, in the shape of toothsome lozenges and virgin honey. Neither had he the least regard, but he never had much, for the tailors, where the newest metropolitan waistcoat patterns were hanging up, which by some strange transformation always looked amazing there and never appeared at all like the same thing anywhere else. But he stopped to read the playbill at the theatre, and surveyed the doorway with a kind of awe, which was not diminished when a sallow gentleman with long dark hair came out and told a boy to run home to his lodgings and bring down his broadsword. Mr. Pinch stood rooted to the spot on hearing this, and might have stood there until dark, but that the old cathedral bell began to ring for vespers service, on which he tore himself away. Now the organist's assistant was a friend of Mr. Pinch's, which was a good thing, for he too was a very quiet, gentle soul, and had been, like Tom, a kind of old-fashioned boy at school, though well liked by the noisy fellow too. As good luck would have it, Tom always said he had great good luck. The assistant chanced that very afternoon to be on duty by himself, with no one in the dusty organ loft but Tom. So while he played, Tom helped him with the stops, and finally, the service being just over, Tom took the organ himself. It was then turning dark, and the yellow light that streamed in through the ancient windows in the choir was mingled with a murky red. As the grand tones resounded through the church, they seemed, to Tom, to find an echo in the depth of every ancient tomb, no less than in the deep mystery of his own heart. Great thoughts and hopes came crowding on his mind as the rich music rolled upon the air, and yet among them, something more grave and solemn in their purpose, but the same, were all the images of that day, down to its very lightest recollection of childhood. The feeling that the sounds awakened, in the moment of their existence, seemed to include his whole life and being, and as the surrounding realities of stone and wood and glass grew dimmer in the darkness, these visions grew so much the brighter that Tom might have forgotten the new pupil and the expectant master, and have sat there pouring out his grateful heart till midnight, but for a very earthy old verger insisting on locking up the cathedral forthwith. So he took leave of his friend with many thanks, groped his way out as well as he could into the now lamplighted streets, and hurried off to get his dinner. End of chapter 5, part 1.